I wasn't looking for a lost civilization when I started digging into municipal water records from the late 1800s. I was actually trying to understand a much more mundane topic: the history of public plumbing and the transition from private wells to centralized city systems. I expected a story of progress, a linear evolution of lead pipes and wooden conduits leading toward the convenience of the modern world. But as I sat in the dim light of local archives, panning through digitized blueprints and sepia-toned photographs of Victorian-era squares, I realized the numbers didn't match the beauty on the page. I found myself staring at images of fountains that seemed to mock the very idea of utility. Notice this photograph of a public fountain in a small, provincial town, dated 1872. Zoom in on the central spire. Look at the surgical precision of the granite carvings, the way the limestone appears almost liquid, flowing into intricate geometric patterns that resemble cymatic frequencies more than decorative masonry. According to the official record, this was built by a local stonecutter using primitive chisels and horse-drawn transport, completed in less than 5 months during a period of economic depression. We are told these were ornamental luxuries, provided by benevolent city fathers to provide water for horses and the occasional weary traveler. But look closer. Notice the copper finials atop the structure. Look at the way the water doesn't just pour. It is pulsed through specific, repetitive geometries. When you examine the engineering reports of the time, or rather the lack of them, a logic bomb begins to tick. Why would a society struggling with basic sanitation, a society supposedly using outhouses and kerosene lamps, expend hundreds of thousands of man-hours to create a fountain network that rivals the craftsmanship of the Renaissance? Why are these fountains often the very first things built in a new city, appearing in photographs of muddy, unpaved streets where the people are still living in shacks? The official explanation is simple, neat, and contained. It was the City Beautiful movement, a brief obsession with aesthetics meant to uplift the urban poor. They tell us it was a matter of civic pride. But this explanation collapses the moment you apply the lens of logistics. You don't build a Stradivarius to hold a door open, and you don't build a frequency-calibrated granite and copper resonance chamber just to water a horse. Look at the shadows in these old photos. The streets are often empty, the people looking small, ragged, and out of place next to these towering monuments of hydro-engineering. It's as if they didn't build them. They simply found them and turned the valves back on. We see grand openings of fountains that look centuries old the day the ribbon is cut. We see intricate networks of fountains that were later demolished or stripped of their metal components during the World Wars under the guise of scrap drives. The official narrative wants us to believe these were merely for drinking. But if you look at the placement, the way they sit on ley lines, the way they occupy the centers of star-shaped plazas, you begin to suspect a different purpose. These weren't just fountains. They were part of a global, decentralized network of healing. They were the nodes of a civilization that understood the memory of water and the power of atmospheric resonance. And then, quite suddenly, the water stopped being healing, and it started being managed. The fountains were capped, the statues were removed, and the network was banished from our collective memory. Once you see the impossible complexity of these structures against the primitive backdrop of the 19th century, the ornamental explanation becomes an insult to your intelligence. You realize you are looking at an inheritance, not a construction. You are looking at the remnants of a world where health was a public right, vibrating through the very air and water of the city square, before it was replaced by the meter and the chemical treatment plant. If you are finding this investigation valuable, please subscribe to keep this research alive. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Have you noticed these anomalies in your own streets? When we move past the aesthetics and apply the cold, hard lens of structural engineering, The official story of these fountain networks begins to suffer a total mathematical breakdown. To build even one of these Tartarian fountains, structures like the Bethesda Fountain in New York or the lost water monuments of the Chicago World's Fair, requires a level of material science that the mid-19th century simply did not possess in its public records. We are talking about solid blocks of granite and marble, weighing tens of tons, carved with a surgical precision that suggests the use of high-speed sonic drills or advanced molding techniques. Consider the labor force of the 1870s. The official narrative tells us these cities were being carved out of the wilderness by men with hammers, chisels, and horse-drawn wagons. Yet the logistics of transporting a 30-ton monolithic basin through unpaved, muddy streets, only to lift it 50 feet into the air and set it with millimeter accuracy, is a feat that would challenge a modern construction crew with hydraulic cranes. There is a profound mathematical contradiction here. The timeframes given for these constructions are often less than a year, yet the curing time for the specialized cements and the manual carving of the Antiquitech ornamentation would realistically take decades for a team of thousands. Then we must look at the material science of the fountain's internal workings. These weren't simple pipes. Many of these fountains featured intricate copper and brass tuning elements buried deep within the masonry. In the world of Tartaria, copper wasn't just a conductor for electricity, it was used for its resonance properties. The water was not being pumped by coal-fired steam engines located miles away. It was moved through the use of vortex technology and atmospheric pressure differentials created by the very spires and domes that topped the fountains. This is Antiquitech, technology that utilized the ether to energize the water, giving it properties that the modern world has been taught to dismiss as miraculous or impossible. The funding for these projects is equally baffling. Why would a fledgling city still struggling to build basic housing and roads spend the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars on healing water nodes? The answer is found in the inheritance theory. We did not design these networks, we found them. We are like hermit crabs that have crawled into the empty, magnificent shells of a grander civilization. We occupied their cities, utilized their remaining infrastructure, and for a few brief decades, we even let their water flow. Notice the foundations of these fountains in old city plans. They often connect to vast vaulted brick tunnels that lead nowhere, or rather, lead to places the official history has since sealed off or labeled as sewers. These were the arteries of a global healing system. The water was ionized, structured by the geometry of the fountain, and offered freely to the public. But free energy and free health are the enemies of centralized control. The coordination required to build such a system across every continent simultaneously is proof of a unified global culture, a culture that was deliberately reset to make way for the age of scarcity and monetization. As we look beyond the borders of a single town or a single continent, we begin to see that this was not an isolated architectural trend. The pattern repeats with a consistency that defies the geographic and political boundaries of the 19th century. From the majestic fountains of Peterhof in St. Petersburg to the ornate water monuments of Melbourne, Australia, and the vanished cascades of the Trocadero in Paris, the same Antiquitech motifs appear. We see the same copper-capped spires, the same limestone basins, and the same specific sacred geometries designed to structure the water as it fell. The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. How could architects in 1860, separated by vast oceans and months of travel, arrive at an identical, highly specialized engineering template for hydro-resonance? The official narrative suggests they were all inspired by the classics, but inspiration does not explain the identical plumbing schematics or the specific metallurgical composition of the tuning forks often found embedded in these structures. If we were truly evolving independently, we would see a chaotic variety of styles and methods. Instead, we see a global signature, a unified, technological brand that suggests a single, planetary administration or a shared heritage that was active much more recently than we are told. Look at the maps from the late 1700s. Notice the regions labeled Grand Tartaria or Tartary. These areas are often depicted with sophisticated infrastructure that the history books tell us didn't exist until the mid-1800s. When you overlay the locations of these vanished or repurposed fountains with the borders of this old world, the map begins to glow with a hidden logic. These fountains were the lifeblood of the Tartarian world. They were strategically placed in urban centers to act as massive, passive air purifiers and health generators. By vibrating the water at specific frequencies, they could supposedly mitigate the heavy energy of a city, keeping the population calm, healthy, and connected to the Earth's natural resonance. In our current reality, we are taught that water is a commodity, something to be bottled, sold, and treated with chlorine and fluoride. But in the Tartarian paradigm, water was a carrier of information. The fountains were the broadcasting towers of that information. Notice the world's fairs that sprouted up across the globe between 1850 and 1915. These events were always centered around massive, glowing water features and electric fountains. The official story says these fairs were built from temporary plaster of Paris and wood, meant to be demolished after 6 months. But the photos tell a different story. They show solid stone, deep foundations, and a level of hydro-engineering that would take decades to plan. The pattern suggests that these fairs were actually reset festivals, the final public display of the inherited Tartarian technology before it was systematically dismantled. They showed the people the wonders of healing water and free energy one last time, labeling them as temporary exhibits, so that when they were destroyed, the public wouldn't feel they had lost their own heritage. They were told it was progress to move toward the centralized metered systems we have today. The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore because the erasure was as global as the architecture itself. Every city followed the same script: build the fountain, celebrate it, claim it was an ornamental luxury, and then eventually let it fall into disrepair or modernize it by removing the very components that made it functional. We are looking at a world that was once connected by a shimmering web of water and frequency, a world where the city square was a place of rejuvenation, not just commerce. Once you see the repetition of these Antiquitech water nodes across the entire face of the Earth, you realize that the history of our independent nations is a thin veil pulled over a much more magnificent, unified past. The fountains weren't built for us. We simply walked into the plaza while the water was still flowing. If this global network of healing water was so magnificent, so pervasive, and so essential to the human experience, why is it that we can find no mention of its true purpose in any modern textbook? This is where we encounter the most chilling aspect of the 19th century reset: the systematic removal of evidence. Between 1850 and 1920, a window of time that history portrays as an era of industrial revolution, something far more calculated was occurring. The grand fountains of the old world were not just being neglected, they were being silenced. The tactics were varied, but universally effective. First came the renovations. We see countless records of city councils ordering the removal of copper domes and finials from public water features, claiming they were outdated or in need of repair. In reality, they were stripping the antennas and conductors that allowed the fountains to pull energy from the atmosphere. Then came the Great Fires: Chicago, Boston, Seattle, and dozens of others. In the aftermath of these suspicious conflagrations, the stone and metal infrastructure of the previous civilization was cleared away with startling speed, replaced by the gray, utilitarian boxes of the modern age. Even more suspicious is the fate of the world's fairs. These white cities were filled with thousands of fountains that produced what witnesses described as living water and luminous spray. Yet as soon as the gates closed, these structures were dynamited. We are told they were made of temporary materials, But when you look at the demolition photos, you see massive masonry blocks and iron supports that would have lasted 1,000 years. The official record remains stagnant, offering no explanation for why such wealth and technology would be discarded so casually. The silence is deafening. This institutional refusal to address the sheer logistics of this global infrastructure is a cornerstone of the reset. Historians look at a photo of a street-level window buried in mud next to a 5-story granite fountain, and they see nothing. They refuse to answer the basic question, where are the blueprints? Why is it that the architectural plans for the most complex water networks in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg are missing, lost in a fire, or simply never existed? The archives have been scrubbed of the how, leaving us only with a sanitized, magical when. We must carefully speculate about this 19th century reset window. It appears that a coordinated effort was made to transition the human race from a decentralized, health-based society to one dependent on centralized, chemical-based control. By destroying the fountains and replacing them with hidden lead-lined pipes and metered taps, they disconnected us from the Earth's natural frequency. We went from drinking the healing water to consuming the managed fluid. The physical structures that remain are now nothing more than decorative tombs, silent monuments to a technology we are no longer allowed to understand. To stand before the dry, silent basins of these remaining fountains today is to feel a profound sense of mourning, even if you cannot quite name what has been lost. We have been conditioned to accept a world of gray concrete, of efficient utility, and of a health system that is reactive and profitable rather than proactive and free. But when you look at the evidence of the Tartarian fountain network, you are catching a glimpse of a lost utopia. It was a world where beauty was not a luxury for the elite, but the very fabric of the public square. Imagine a city where the air was perpetually scrubbed clean by the mist of 1,000 frequency-tuned fountains. Imagine a society where medicine was as simple as sitting near a limestone monument that vibrated with the healing resonance of the earth itself. This was a world of abundance, of elegance, and of a deep, symbiotic relationship with the elements. Compare that to our modern degradation, the relentless noise of combustion engines, the unsightly tangle of power lines, and the sterile chemical taste of the water that reaches our homes through miles of dark, pressurized lead. We are living in a downgraded civilization, occupying the grand ruins of a society that was far more advanced in its understanding of human biology and atmospheric energy than we are today. We have been robbed of an inheritance that should have made our lives easy, healthy, and filled with aesthetic wonder. Instead, we are told that the 19th century was a time of filth and struggle, a narrative designed to make us grateful for our current state of technological and spiritual poverty. This is the power of the unseeing. Before you began this investigation, a fountain was just a decoration, a place to toss a coin or take a tourist photo. But now, as you walk through your own city, the world looks different. You see the copper caps not as ornaments, but as antennas. You see the deep vaulted foundations not as basements, but as the remains of a subterranean energy grid. Once you see the deliberate hand of a superior civilization in the stone and spray of the old world, you can't unsee the robbery that has taken place. You realize that we aren't the peak of human achievement. We are the survivors of a catastrophe, sifting through the wreckage of a paradise we were never supposed to remember. The story of the Banished fountain network is more than a mystery of plumbing or architecture. It is the story of our own amnesia. We stand in the shadows of giants, looking at the remnants of a world that offered us health and harmony as a birthright, yet we are taught to see only ornament and decoration. We are told that the history of our progress is a straight line, but the stone and copper evidence of the 19th century suggests a sudden, jagged break, A moment where a superior way of living was systematically dismantled to make room for a world of meters and bills. Was there truly a global reset that turned off the healing frequencies of our cities? The evidence is etched into every granite basin and every impossible carving left behind in our public squares. We are left with the dry shells of a technology we can no longer replicate, living as hermit crabs in the magnificent infrastructure of a civilization that was erased before we could understand its true value. The questions remain, vibrating in the silence of these abandoned monuments. Who turned off the water? Why were we told it was just a style? And what else have we forgotten? The evidence is all around us, waiting for you to see it. If this video resonated with you, please like and share it to help break the algorithm's silence. Subscribe for the next part of the investigation. The truth is waiting.